What would a perfect tier list look like? What would perfect mean in this context? Is there such a thing as something being objectively perfect? Is there even such a thing as a tier list being correct? If something is right, but isn't communicated properly, what is it actually worth? All of these things have been endlessly running through my mind recently. It's not really that I think it's something deep and philosophical, and more so that the ADHD and OCD have a nasty team-up ability that makes me hyperfixate on seemingly meaningless things like this. If you have a history of watching the things I make on this channel, you'll know I tout some of the tier lists I make on my YouTube shorts as perfect. And while I already admit this is mostly a moniker for flair and not to be taken absolutely literally, they are intended to approach something like perfect in order to be as objective and accurate as possible. Obviously, that doesn't stop cretins with opinions from spouting drivel about how their beloved character is actually the strongest character ever, and they can prove it because they got MVP earlier today, thus showing they have irrefutable evidence their character must be busted, which, honestly to me, it seems a bit wild that nobody is willing to give them self-credit for playing well, but it must be born of some mental complex after having received harassment from even lesser intelligent Cro-Magnon who blame their losses on these people just trying to play the characters they like. Yes, if it wasn't obvious from the myriad of videos I've made on this topic in the past, I'm starkly in favor of people playing what they enjoy in spite of what any tier list or disgruntled teammate says, and yet for even attempting to make tier lists in the first place, I receive the ire of one-tricks and low-tier so-called deities the world over. I should be a champion to these people, but for merely speaking the truth, I am a pariah. Obviously, I'm waxing poetic here to try to get you to laugh, or maybe more realistically smile a bit, but I want to draw this back to my obsession with tier lists and trying to make them perfect. In this video, I want to dissect what makes a tier list accurate, as well as dive into why the conveyance of the tier list's findings, mostly the presentation of the tier list itself and how it's put together, affect the way it's actually perceived, a task that becomes immensely more complicated when you're trying to be accurate and unbiased. None of this will save me from getting told I'm bronze, despite the fact, at least for the game I make these lists for, I'm provably in a rank far beyond that, but I do still feel that there will be a lot of worth to this dissection and discussion, regardless of what game you play. Yes, the list we'll use as Frankenstein's monster here for all of this will be a Marvel Rivals tier list, but feel free to use the methods we discuss here to construct a tier list for whatever game you play, as I find that it would likely only take minimal effort to make the changes necessary to use this method for a different game's context. This is making the perfect tier list. Gosh, did this video take a lot of work. That's why I'm really quickly going to ask you to like and subscribe. I know it's not the kind of content that usually does the best on here, but I think it's some of what people get the most out of. If YouTube didn't have neurodivergently obsessed rants, what kind of dystopia would we be in? I'm in a difficult spot right now trying to reunite with my family, and immigration is both expensive and time-consuming, making finding the time to make stuff like this difficult, and any help, even just a like or comment, helps a lot. Thank you, genuinely. Okay. I was about to start with the calculations we use, but we actually need to start with something more obvious, and something I haven't really talked in depth enough about before: data. Data honestly already creates a roadblock in our goal of trying to aim for perfection. Depending on the game you play, data can be well documented to non-existent. For our guinea pig example, Marvel Rivals, we have two real sources we can look at, but both have their flaws. The most obvious would have to be Marvel Rivals' Hero Hot List. This is officially provided data, making it a really reliable source. So what's the catch? There are a few. Most notably, the data is incomplete. While the data can be sorted by rank, which we will discuss in a bit, it is completely lacking an entire section, ban rate. This is imperative because ban rate directly affects pick rate in Marvel Rivals. A character cannot be picked if they are banned, meaning that this pick rate is misleading. That's not where it ends, however. I would be remiss to not mention the infrequency of updates, as this list gets quite old before it gets updated. But there's one other notable flaw. As commenter Ryan pointed out in a short of mine not long ago, the data is weighted by role. Now, for example, if we were looking at competitive Overwatch, this would not be an issue. Actually, I should rephrase. This is an unavoidable issue with Overwatch, as the game has role queue forcing a certain number of each role per game. This means that comparing heroes across roles becomes much less accurate, as you have no way of knowing just how often this character would be picked against a character within another role if it weren't for the fact these characters are placed into differently portioned buckets of arbitrary necessity. So that's a flaw of role queue data, albeit an inevitable one. However, this situation is quite different. Marvel Rivals has no role queue, meaning that portioning per role is completely absurd. As an example, there is nothing stopping you from having a team without a single tank. So when the percents within the tank role equal out to about 100%, or you look and find the same is true for the other roles, you realize that this data cannot be used whatsoever for comparing heroes across roles. There is nothing to dictate how often these characters are actually genuinely being picked, instead only useful in comparison to the characters sharing their role. So while this data could be used as part of a calculation for comparing characters within their own roles every month or so, overall it amounts to nothing more than a trap for anyone trying to understand the game. This is a data trash heap, incomplete, misleading, and stagnant, a product of ineptitude. So then, Marvel Rivals players are left with only one realistic option, turning to community-sourced data. Now, problems still exist with community-sourced data. Their accuracy can be skewed by a few different factors. The first would have to be the fact that not all data is being tracked. As far as I can tell, Rivals Tracker, for example, can only draw data from what it can see. I'm not sure how exactly it does this, and if someone knows the inner workings a bit more, please feel free to comment and enlighten us, but I think I can at least compose an accurate guess. Rivals Tracker likely draws from two sources, looking at profiles and looking at matches. I know it doesn't just look at profiles, as it has ban rates, which means that it at least has some knowledge of what goes on during matches, given profile data won't give you ban rates. At the same time, I know that Rivals Tracker can look at profiles, so it wouldn't be a stretch to say it draws some data from this specifically. I suppose realistically it could just look at match history data from profiles, and it wouldn't need anything else to determine its rates, but who knows. Either way, we know that at least one factor likely creates difficulty in keeping this data perfectly accurate: private profiles. Now, in Marvel Rivals, private profiles are a bit complex, as you can hide or show different aspects of your profile selectively, but one aspect that is hideable is your match history. Now, if someone hides their profile, the tracker could circumvent this by just looking at the match through another player's profile, thus getting the win rates, ban rates, pick rates, and whatnot it needs. But what happens if every player's profile in this match is private? Now, there is a chance that the tracker also pays attention during gameplay, but even then, what if nobody is using it during gameplay? I also have my doubts it uses this for its data, as it would sound much easier to just draw this data solely from match history. So, almost without doubt, we know that player-sourced data is not perfectly accurate, and so, thus our journey toward a perfect tier list is already foiled, right? Not really. We actually already addressed during the preamble to this video that perfection may be an unattainable goal, so regardless of how this step would end up going, we would still run into that barrier. But still aiming for the goal of being as accurate and unbiased as possible, and given the myriad of flaws with the official data, community-sourced data is our best option. Though it may not be able to track data from every match, it's still aiming for our same goal of accuracy with what it has. Now that we have all of this data, it's time to move on to our next step: interpreting this data to evaluate character power. This, in particular, is where a lot of the discussion starts about how our perfect list could possibly be wrong. But I still stand by my calculation wholeheartedly, and though I've addressed it in the past, I think a deeper dissection of it will help prove my point of why it's the right way to do things. I want to solidify the aim of our tier list. We are assessing the strength of characters within the game in comparison to each other. We are not looking at the skill it takes to play a character. We are not saying a character cannot be won with, or that nobody can succeed with that character even in the highest ranks. We are not even trying to determine what character is best to main. We are solely looking at how the character's kit compares with other characters' kits, and how capable that kit is of leading to success in general. Something people often fallaciously point out with these lists are things like, oh, that's how strong that character is when they have blank teammate, or that's how good they are on blank map, or this list is biased against blank role, or something like that. You have to understand that none of these things are left out of consideration. In fact, it's the fact that they are all taken into consideration that likely messes up these people's views. The best way to understand this is that characters are affected by situation, whether it be an allied team comp, enemy matchup, map. All of this does affect a hero's power, and our rankings are there to average these things. It's up to the player to recognize what situations each character is likely to shine or fail in. A character in S tier could still feel miserable if they're directly in a situation designed to make them fail, while a D tier character could still shine if they have one set of circumstances that makes them overpowered. That is why some characters that may seem to be really strong or weak in certain situations may be in tiers that confuse some players. You have to try to consider more situations than just the ones you've seen these characters in recently. The aim of our list will be such that the character is almost treated like their own entity. They will only exist in matches where they can exist, so no punishment for a character being unpicked just because they're banned, and whenever available, they will be seen as a tool available for the purpose of winning. A piece of the puzzle that is that specific match. Their strengths, their weaknesses, their abilities, their hitboxes, the numbers on each of their stats, all of it just a means to the end of winning each match. We're measuring how likely it is in any specific match that that specific hero is the best option, or in other words, the most powerful. I think in essence, that's what the vast majority of other tier lists do, though they rarely outright explain it this thoroughly. And the reason I choose to do so is just because some people get lost in the sauce, losing sight of what the actual goal of the list is and what power actually means in the context of the game. It's precisely part of the reason why devs don't always just balance for strength. Something that isn't fun to play against, isn't fun to play as, or that just strips any player of too much player agency, just isn't healthy for the game, regardless of power level. Hey, that's something I discussed in my first ever YouTube video. Now, I mentioned how we would be addressing bans briefly, but bans are something that could easily be handled in a different way logically, and it could still make sense. They are also important to address because they are so vastly different between different games that the mechanics of what a character being banned means is a pretty big deal to trying to make a math-based tier list. In MOBAs in the past, for example, I considered a few different methods for measuring power via ban rate. Ban rate is essentially, no matter what, to be considered something akin to pick rate, as it realistically is just a rate that has a very direct effect on pick rate. Character isn't there? Well, I can't pick them, but that doesn't necessarily mean I didn't want to. In days of yore, when I would watch professional Smite, I had two methods I used to use. One I toyed with the idea of was having banned characters just be considered on the team. This was a pretty realistic way of looking at things. The character is banned because it was likely to be picked, so it should just kinda be considered as being picked. The fact that isn't completely true, and they may not have even gotten picked aside, the really confusing part comes when you say, well, on which team? Because it really does matter which team you are considering the banned character to be a part of if you use that method. I understand it could be easy to just say, it's the team that banned the character, and there's a lot of merit to that idea. If the team that banned the character wins, it probably meant that the character countered their strategy in some way, and is thus powerful. I also, at the same time, had the opposite consideration too, however. If the team that banned the character expected that character to be a part of the enemy comp, doesn't that in some way kind of mean that they are part of the enemy's composition? Honestly now, I feel like I lean more toward the former way of thinking, but all of this still glaringly has the issue I mentioned earlier, where these don't necessarily actually mean the character was going to get picked, let alone then go on to win. So I even toyed around with the idea of banned characters being considered half-picked by both teams. This means calculations could easily be made where you take the character's ban rate and shove it into their pick rate, adding them together in order to get their actual pick rate. But this is again just one method with flaws. What if the character wouldn't have been picked is one way of looking at things, but what about the opposite? What if the character is always banned because they are so unbelievably busted that people start considering ban rate just as indicative of power, if not more so than pick rate? I think a lot of players feel this way, but I don't think just assuming that when you try to make a dataset is healthy. While pick rate bias gets evened out a bit by things like rank filtering and win rate, ban rate doesn't really have these obstacles, and thus player perception really could just lead to a character getting banned constantly that shouldn't. People may just hate playing against or as that character. Rivals, thankfully, makes this a bit more simple for my calculation by being a little less strategic than something like MOBA bans, by being more simplistic in general. Instead of teams just taking turns to ban one after the other, and then having characters only appear once per team, teams just vote at the same time, and can mirror more than just comps, they can even mirror bans. This is why I've decided to just find our actual pick rate by removing games where the character gets banned from the question. So our accurate pick rate is derived by subtracting the ban rate of 100% and then dividing the pick rate by the result. Before we move on in our calculation, however, or even just dare starting to use it, even this portion with bans, we need to discuss where we are getting our data and why that place is only the top ranks. This is yet another spot where my method gets a lot of criticism, but doing it any other way is completely illogical. I don't want to rehash entire discussions I've had in the past too much, so I'll try to explain either briefly or in some details I haven't really expressed before. But I, for example, have one guy who comments all the time about how win rate is the only thing that should matter, and it should be from every rank. We'll get to why win rate alone is meaningless and we actually need pick rate in a bit, but let's first focus on why looking at lower ranks tells us nothing. Our goal with this is trying to express how powerful each character is, representing characters almost like tools and trying to understand their potential for solving the problems of trying to win each match. Gosh, how do I accurately express this? A tank, not like the role in the game, a literal tank is powerful, right? Like, you'd say it's more powerful than a stick, right? Like, many magnitudes over more powerful? Well, I disagree. Because I have these toddlers right here, and I gave one of them a stick, and the other a tank. Tank toddler is getting poked in the eye with the stick right now, and honestly, the stick's seeming much more powerful in my opinion. Oh, but the toddler isn't properly utilizing the tank. Well, I hardly see why that should matter. Shouldn't ease of use factor into this? I mean, he can't even crawl into the damn thing. The stick is there, it's potent, it's pointy, stick clearly wins. Looking at what succeeds when tools are being improperly utilized is pointless. With the vast scope of each individual player that's in the metal ranks, any number of things could be broken or unplayable to each and every one of them. You'll absolutely run into certain characters or strategies that are specifically known for pulverizing low rank players, like Bastion in Overwatch 1, or even just what remains of that kind of kit in Punisher's design. But that doesn't make a stationary turret the most powerful thing in the game. Run a few more iterations of what is optimal, and quickly you'll find that playing around this turret in certain ways almost always leads to victory for the other team. You may learn how to more effectively brutalize lower ranks from a tier list geared at lower tiers, but much more important at those lower ranks is playing what you're good at, and what you want to get better at. Moreover, general understanding and learning of the game is what propels you to victory in lower and average ranks, not hero choice. I cannot fathom how someone could view tier lists as more useful at lower ranks, but this is devoid of logic. Please, if you are lower rank, take all tier lists with a grain of salt, and while they may be accurate, focus on your hero pool, as well as improving at the game, including if that means expanding your own hero pool. Looking at higher ranks does one other really important thing, however. It actually solves one of the biggest criticisms this strategy of assessing data utilizes. I mentioned it very briefly earlier, it makes up for bias. One of the most common criticisms my math has gotten is, "Oh, but pick rate is affected by player bias. People won't play so-and-so character, or they will play more so-and-so character." And this would be completely true if we were just looking at all of the data, but we're looking at the highest ranks only. But doesn't that make the bias even worse? That's an even smaller pool of people to draw from. Yeah, a highly skilled and highly knowledgeable pool of players who understand the game better and only maintain their high rank because they are succeeding. Remember what the whole goal of this data is? Trying to figure out what characters are the best at finding success, i.e. winning? How do you think those players got to where they are? Now, I'm sure there is bias, and we can't perfectly account for this, but we can sure as heck do a hell lot better at mitigating this than any system where you just try to draw solely win rate from any source. While this is a bit about player psychology, I assure you that the players at the top are not just bumbling about playing only what they like and just being so much more skilled at the game than everyone else that it doesn't really matter what the hell they play. There really is a portion of players like this, but they are typically only proportionate to how able that character is to realistically win often. Yes, 100% you will see penny players in One Above All, but that doesn't necessarily mean she's busted, and if there are much less penny players in Eternity and One Above All than there are Magneto players, or if you find that penny mains even have to swap onto Magneto occasionally, whereas Magneto mains are not swapping nearly as often onto penny, do you really think it's all just bias? Or is there something going on here with how often these characters are actually effective? Bias is always going to be a factor of these lists, but there's nothing anyone else can do to account for it, at least not to a degree that keeps things as accurate as we have. Alongside this, we need to talk about why pick rate and ban rate absolutely need each other. It is imperative that you understand that these numbers in a vacuum are almost useless without each other if your goal is understanding character strength. Win rate may seem like the end-all be-all, but that couldn't be further from the truth. I think it was like Season 1, maybe Season 0, something early, where Iron Fist was substantially weaker than he has been recently. At the very least, he was perceived as quite weak, and I don't think that was too far from the truth. But he had one of the highest win rates in the game, especially at high rank. What gives? Was Iron Fist secretly busted? No, not at all, and this just shows how tainted data can be if we only look at win rate. His pick rate was immensely low. So how does that explain the win rate then? Two primary scenarios. The first is that players only really played Iron Fist in scenarios where they understood he would be really good. Let's say Iron Fist has a certain character he's really good against. Knowledgeable, high-level players who know how to play the character may not often use him just because he fails in other scenarios. But when they see a character he's good against, or even a map he's good on, or any situation, they pull him out, and bam, Iron Fist's win rate is absurdly good now, despite still being a weak character. The other scenario affecting this is utilization by specialists. Some players are absolute experts at one or a few characters, and they will make the character shine. This, in some way, goes slightly against my argument from earlier, but I don't really feel it truly refutes it. While accounting for every player in the world's skill and usability per character is a bit absurd, I don't think usability by the best of the best should be unaccounted for. Not every professional is going to be a master of Iron Fist, but many will at least understand what they generally need to do on Luna. I don't think too much power should be placed just into ease of use, thus another reason why we still only track the highest level of play, but just because the tiniest percentage of the tiniest percentage, i.e. just a few people in the already small sample of the highest rank in the game, being really cracked at Iron Fist, shouldn't give him absurdly more credit than he deserves on our list. I think this realistically should just be chalked up as account somewhat for human error. If being pro level at the game doesn't mean you can play them at pro level, they shouldn't just be considered stronger suddenly for having a higher win rate with absurdly low pick rate. On the flip side, this is actually a lot less common, but does reflect in the data in smaller magnitudes. If a character is picked really often, but is performing poorly despite this, it may indicate the character is currently overvalued by the pros. Again, this is typically less strikingly obvious, as pros typically understand why they are playing what they're playing, but you can see this happen still if you scrutinize metas. In the 2016 Hearthstone World Championship, for example, ESA made a small video on that tournament, the general consensus was that Druid was crazy good, but it ended up getting eaten alive by several decks when the actual tournament happened. It was still quite powerful, but its power was a bit overvalued, and many players saw it end up being the gap in their lineup's armor. So how do we account for all of this? Well, it's really simple actually. Arrange the data by the top ranks, filter out ban rate using the calculation we mentioned, and then multiply the win rate by the pick rate. Congratulations! You have your perfect math for character power. I slightly glossed over it, as it's really a dealer's choice kind of thing, but you will have to use some logic yourself to decide what you consider the high ranks. If I trust the ranked system at all, you could just draw data from the literal highest rank, but for our data for now, especially given we have more sparse data nowadays with private profiles, I'm using my channel member Wisefool's proposed method of using both One Above All and Eternity and averaging them together, given Rivals Tracker separates their data. This could give slight bias to the higher, smaller rank here, One Above All, but I mean, oh no, the higher rank is getting bias? Didn't we just talk about why that would make sense? Feel free to choose what ranks you utilize for your own game, but try to not let it be too low or you may pull in too much lower level play bias. This seems like the end, doesn't it? Just shove this onto a list and we're golden. What if I told you this part is the whole reason this video exists? Because this part is the part I've had so much trouble with. The part that really affects how people will see your perfect tier list. You have to understand, I've been making lists like this based off of unbiased math, the supposed perfect tier list, for a while now, and let me tell you, do they draw some hateful comments. That's not completely surprising of a tier list, in fact that's pretty par for the course. You say someone's beloved character is comparatively weak, you're a villain. You say Bastion isn't OP, they tell you you must have been dropped on your head as a child. But actually, what you do from here is pretty far from straightforward. Oh, just shove it into a tier list, right? Let's make the top tier S, and wait, how do we arrange things? Well, I'll tell you what the hyperfixation gremlins used to tell me to do. They used to say, it's a letter grading system, right? Why does nobody use C for the average? C was supposed to be the average in school. Let's do that. Let's find the average of our power levels, divide 75 by that average, and multiply the entire data set by 75. Now, whatever number they get, we give them a grade like if it were a school assignment. Surely they can't be that absurd if graded the same way we were in school. You want to see what kind of thing that gets you? A list like this. Now, this is incredibly accurate, but holy cow, what's even going on? I show this to the average Overwatch player and they drool at the mouth. Well, honestly, they were already drooling like that when I got here. Maybe that didn't have anything to do with me, and that's just the average Overwatch player's natural state. But my point is that this is a bit beyond just unconventional. So I tried to rein it in by pulling at the two ends of the scale. Let's just say anything above S is above S, and anything below Z is below Z. Perfect. But while this list is a bit easier to read, it's still really misleading in some way. People will point to a list like this and say, "Hella is really good. What the heck is wrong with your list?" And it's like, wait, yes, Hella is really good. Look how high she is. She's one of the strongest characters. But the break in communication here is that players are used to seeing these lower tiers as being garbage. To the average onlooker, I essentially just called the entire cast unplayable. That isn't even remotely what I was trying to convey, and my own bias for any individual character had absolutely no hand in even creating the list. So how on earth did we end up here? How your data is conveyed is not just half the battle, at least for reaching the majority of people here. It's the entire battle. It hardly matters what you even say. That's why lists are just people giving their opinions one after the other. And it doesn't really matter whether you watch one of the most skilled and knowledgeable players in the community, or some random guy in Plat who thinks Wanda is really good this or any season. There are going to be comments telling them that they are brain dead no matter what. So while the goal of not getting hate comments may be unrealistic, I don't think it's far-fetched at all to want to make this perfect tier list something digestible for the average person. So that's where I found myself, mulling over how to do this, and this is what I came up with. So I gathered a new set of data, threw it through the calculations, and got my raw numbers. Now was the real moment. I needed to understand who I was communicating with. I needed to relearn the language, and not just let ADHD hold the steering wheel all by itself. You can hold half. And so, I looked to Reddit. No, I'm just kidding. I just did some very basic research on tier lists. Now, supposedly, the typical section for average characters in a tier list is considered B. But we've seen in the past that a tier list having an average can still be absurdly confusing to the average person. So I wanted my list to go beyond. I think a tier list or ranking system or anything similar is most easily understood when the mean, median, and mode are all the same tier. I'd even wager that part of the reason Marvel Rivals' ranked system feels a bit off is because they don't utilize this strategy currently. While the median and mode are both gold, the mean is actually platinum. Sure, this shouldn't create too much distress, but you can see people mentioning all the time how so many players are boosted. This is obviously because of engagement-based matchmaking and performance-based stats, but this distribution is atypical. I don't think it's massively far from something that could be healthy, and I think people fixating on the fact that it's not a perfect bell is honestly placing your concerns in the wrong spot, especially when people say ridiculous things like, "There shouldn't be more people in Grandmaster 3 than Diamond 1. Obviously that's going to happen. That's so obvious. But having the mean, median, and mode all be gold would create a scenario where players can really easily understand another player's general skill just by glancing at their rank. It's just human nature to equate average with each of these three metrics, even if they don't always end up lining up. That's why this list, for example, can have a mean in the middle there somewhere, and still be incomprehensible to someone who doesn't know what mean means. So I wanted the most digestible possible presentation of the most accurate data set. My goal was to make the mean, median, and mode all B tier. This is actually really easy. Want to see how? Womp womp, everyone's B tier. Ooh, I can even put a couple people in A or C. Still B tier. No, the real challenge now was spreading the data as far apart as possible while still keeping B as the mean, median, and mode. And while not just arbitrarily making the tiers different sizes, making sure they are each the same size data-wise, not necessarily character-wise. Now, if you aren't amazing at math, you may not realize how absurd what I just said was. Suffice to say, I just exiled myself to an impossible task of just doing math for the rest of my life. Kinda like when I made that first video on meta and data. At least as far as I'm aware, there isn't an easier way to do it. If you can come up with an easier or more logical way of doing this would absolutely be something I'm interested in hearing. At least as far as I'm currently aware, this would take an absurd amount of time. So some of you may not like this, but since I value my time, I asked ChatGPT to run through iterations over and over again for me. ChatGPT is actually super useful. I know most people use it for writing papers, but this is the last thing I'd use it for because I went to college! Specifically for English. Yes, that's why I'm so verbose and erudite. Yeah, I referenced him again. What are you gonna do about it? No, but for real, ChatGPT is great if you have all of your points in wisdom, and not enough in knowledge or really just memory. Hey, ChatGPT, is my diet killing me? ChatGPT, is this butter healthy? This address seems wrong. What's going on, ChatGPT? ChatGPT, why are sirens going off? Are we safe from nuclear war, ChatGPT? Yes, these are real prompts, slightly edited, that I've asked ChatGPT. I see our relationship as that of Tony Stark and Jarvis. If you actually ever use ChatGPT for anything, you know that it can be really difficult sometimes. Sometimes that's giving it the wrong prompt and it doing what you asked for just in a way you didn't anticipate. We're alike in that, aren't we? But often it's just ChatGPT getting really confused. So, this took a lot of convoluted phrasing and whatnot, but way less time than it would have if I just randomly tried to throw arbitrary divisions of data at the wall aiming for our goal. At some point, I thought I actually had it down, and I think I even got the correct results, but I wanted it to be replicable, and sadly a few days later, when I tried feeding it a new dataset, it just completely forgot what the rules and aims of the list were, in several mind-numbing ways. If any of you know how to automate this in a simpler way, please do tell me, but I think I finally have it working, at least for now. That being said, here it is. The perfect tier list. Ta-da! I genuinely think this is the most accurate Marvel Rivals tier list that has ever been made, as well as the best presented accurate Marvel Rivals tier list. Feel free to adapt this method to whatever game you want, and maybe even show us your results in the Discord. I'd love to see that. Hold up. Normally, I don't do revisions to videos this deep in, as it's really difficult. But it's really important to this topic, so I hope you'll appreciate the extra effort I put in to make this work. Upon trying to run through the numbers to get this latest dataset, I have to say I don't think I trust ChatGPT with this long term. As an example, I've taken the time to confirm that it got the math right on this list you see here, but it took a ton of effort to get a solid answer out of it, as I recognized the first few outputs were erroneous. The mental gymnastics it put me through to get to this list here were absurd. There has to be a way to do this ourselves that doesn't just take an infinite amount of time. It seems like ChatGPT was attempting to use some programming language to analyze the data I gave it and attempt to organize it into the way I asked. So maybe one of our rad programmers in the Discord could make this work without the bumbling AI mucking it up. But honestly, I don't know the first thing about programming. I just like math. So, I guess in some sense, I've made this a repeatable sequence we can use in the future. But I really hope there's a way to cut out the middleman of the AI, cause correcting it feels like grading an infinite supply of homework from the world's dumbest student. I can still get a correct answer, but it takes so much effort, I may as well have done the infinite iterations myself. Now you may be asking yourself, isn't this just an arbitrary way of splitting up the numbers? Yes and no. Well, I guess mostly yes, but if you view it that way, every single tier list is an arbitrary way of splitting up the numbers. Now, the thing I would have initially said I dislike most about this method is that supposedly nothing ties the B tier of this patch to the B tier of next patch. Like, our old lists always had a set of numbers from the data that constituted where each tier ended and began based on the mean. But I've realized that's essentially just what this list does too. In the end, the only thing that ties any of the tiers together in any tier list is just the general balance of the game. So while this list may not use specific numbers based on distance from the mean like our old lists, it really just fluctuates with how strong or weak characters get in relation to the middle point we set with mean, median, and mode. This is the most objective list and list making method we can get that also reads properly for the average tier list enjoyer. This crazy rant has been brought to you by SetoMarie, and Oink. Thank you so much for watching. It means the world to me that you stuck through the whole thing with me. I think I'll be able to put out more tier lists with this method in the future, but this was our full, nothing left out to my knowledge, dive into how we do it, and I had a lot of fun obsessing over this. Please do like and sub and comment and link this to a friend and just everything you can. It helps a lot, helps reunite our family, and helps us achieve a dream that we have with this channel. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. A super duper special thank you to my wonderful channel members, James, Archduke, Wisefool, Bob Saget, Totally a Diva, Bart Simpson, Roman, and Emma. You lot are the best. Thank you, bunnies, so much. Hope to see you all next time. Bye, friends!